So we can go ahead and, like I mentioned, we're going to talk about section 16. So I think, what was it last time? Was section 15? What did we talk about last time, everyone? I can't remember.
It was a lot of SQL stuff.
SQL. Okay. Yeah. So this is going to be, we're going to talk about some XML, JavaScript, not JavaScript, JSON, basically some different formatting of data. And then we're going to talk about recursion, which is really useful when we talk about JSON and XML. And the thing I mentioned is that next week we're going to talk about a couple of things like HTML, CSS, and APIs. So the theme of this basically is like web scraping, like how do you get your data? So a lot of times data is formatted in different ways. We've seen CSVs, comma separated values. We also have TSVs, tab separated values. JSON and XML are another way we can package up data and basically share that information. We'll talk about this in a second, but basically JSONs tend to be a little more modern. XML, it still exists and stuff like that, but I think JSON tends to be the more common theme right now in the industry for at least newer businesses and things like that. And then, yeah, and then talking about like APIs, we'll talk about that. I think that's going to be our next section is APIs. And that will be basically, those are kind of like the ideal form where basically someone else gives you the information and we can just pull that directly. And we'll talk about that for next time. And then HTML and CSS, the reason we're learning about that is basically how to do web scraping. And web scraping is probably like the bottom of the barrel, but like just above taking a survey yourself and creating like something to collect data. So web scraping is definitely like, you can kind of hear it, like you'll hear like data mining, like that kind of stuff. It feels like these dirty words like that people don't really want to do sometimes because as you guys saw in the project, dirty data is not really fun and web scraping is just full of that kind of stuff. So it can take a good majority of the time if you're ever trying to data scrape. But it's a good skill to have because that's sometimes the only way you can get it. All right, so I'm gonna go and start sharing my screen and know that this material I'm gonna show you guys should be already up online on the GitHub repo. So you guys are welcome to like take that and follow along with it, along with different pieces. Okay, so main thing you should know about this is, like I said, JSON and XML. They're basically other ways to format the data. We'll see like what they're related to, but just kind of looking ahead is that JSON stands for JavaScript object notation. And basically it's how you define, if you do any JavaScript, it's basically valid JavaScript. And we'll actually see it's actually quite related to Python. Python processes it pretty well. XML stands for extensible markup language. So if you know HTML is hypertext markup language. XML is basically, in my mind, is kind of like a general HTML. It's structured very similarly, so we see those kind of things. And then we'll compare the two and see what that looks like. All right, so let me go ahead and just run that. So we have our pandas package and we'll dive right into JSON. Okay, quick thing, have either of you guys seen XML formats or JSON formats before? Okay, Susan? No?
Both of them, yeah.
Okay, so Josh, you've seen a few. Yeah, so they're pretty common as you come across it. They're not ideal in that sense of like when we do data science because we like things in nice, neat tables. That's what we tend to use. It's not the only way we use our data. We'll talk about these other things, but like NoSQL and stuff like that too. But anyway, I wanted to show you guys this. So JSON or JSON, right? So JSON objects, not objects, data formats are basically just files. And in these files, they are formatted like this, where you can see that we have our curly brace here, then we have basically like a key here, and then you can see we have basically curly braces within curly braces, and you can see here we have like these square braces. So basically you can kind of think of it, this is like a dictionary, and we'll see this actually relates directly to Python dictionaries. But you can think of these as dictionaries with a key. So this is our key and then our value. In this case, this key points to another, dictionary. I'm going to use that terminology just because we have it in Python. And we also can have arrays. So JSON objects really are really flexible in this way because you can basically have nested arrays or like lists essentially. We can have nested dictionaries. We can have strings. We can have integers, numbers, that kind of stuff. basically information is what we're passing along. Okay, and this is very pretty standard and stuff like this. And what's interesting is that if you do JSON, or not JSON, JavaScript, this is actually valid JavaScript. And it turns out JavaScript actually, the reason why it's called JavaScript object notation, because it comes from JavaScript, but it's also object because it turns out this is how with these curly braces, you can actually, this is how you can define objects basically, or classes in JavaScript. So that's where that terminology comes from. And you can see here, like I said, I call objects is really what this should be, this curly brace, but you'll hear me call it dictionaries just because in Python, that's what a dictionary looks like, right? Like if I copied and paste that and put it into Python, that would make a dictionary. So just not kind of use that interchangeably. But our arrays, which are kind of like our list in Python, you can put strings, like I said, numbers, Boolean, true and false. Note that it's standard in JavaScript to use lowercase true and false versus Python's capital T and capital F. So something to keep in mind. And we can also have null values, which is equivalent, essentially equivalent to Python's nuns. And we'll see when we actually convert our JSON object into Python, we'll see these kind of translated over properly. Okay. Any questions on this JSON object here? Okay, and that's just an example. So this is right here, you can kind of read this like, oh, there's a menu object in here. Okay, and then in that menu, you have the ID of the menu, the value of the menu, right? In this case, just file. This pop-up, right? So this value pop-up, which turns out to be another object. And in that pop-up, there's a menu item, right? And in the menu item, there's a list of values, right? So you can see value, new, create on, open doc. You can basically pass this information along to different, either to do data analysis, or you can even use this to perform actions, essentially like what we call an API, which we'll talk about next time. All right. So this kind of goes to say, all right, before I show you this, I want to show you what this sample.json looks like. So I'm just going into, what are we, JSON XML. So I want to show you what this JSON part looks like. So you can see here, this is my big old JSON file that we're about to read in. And you can see here, what's nice is that Jupyter and most programs will actually kind of try to figure this out and try to find the different pieces of the JSON file. And so you can see here, for example, this starts off as an object. The first thing is meta, which usually is like metadata, information about this stuff going on here. So you can see there's a bunch of information. I can see the next element in here is data. And in that data is basically a list of lists. And you can see in that list, there's a bunch of information right here. So this is kind of like what a JSON object looks like. Note that if you tried opening this up like in the browser, it basically would just be a text file. You wouldn't have any of these fancy little arrows and stuff like that going through. This is basically because Jupyter is being nice and smart to fix that all for us. But you can see it's quite long. Like there's a lot of information going on here. Like in this case, about 1,000 lines. Okay. So let's go back to our guy. So we're going to go ahead and import this package that's built into Python called JSON. Some documentation right here, and basically just opening up a file similar to how we would open up a CSV file before we used Pandas. And we open this up, and we're just going to load this file into data. And the reason why we do it this way is we're not just simply like when you essentially open this file, it's reading it as a text file. But when we use this package JSON.load, it basically says, hey, this is a JSON file. Instead of reading it like a normal text, like basically a big old string, instead what we can do, we can actually process it and make it into more Pythonic attributes. So if you see here, if I do data, so I read this data into here, you can see the data, and you can see here, it looks very similar to like I showed you guys the sample JSON with that structure. But the reason why it looks like that too is because it's actually built around Python. So for example, if I try to do a type on the data, oops, this is not code anymore. I don't know why that was knocked down. But you can see my type of data, which is this, is a dictionary, which makes sense, right? And then we can actually call like the first one, for example, .meta. I could have also, if you guys remember, I tend to use this one, but sometimes it's just quicker. You could have called an element within the dictionary using its key meta. And you can see here's another dictionary, right? And then another dictionary and so on. And then let's see here. Let's say I do data.keys. So we saw that there was data. There was meta. And then do you guys remember what the other one was? There's a couple. data. Oh, so it's data. So you can see I can do data.data, and that'll give us, do I have this actually? Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, oh, it's because it's in property. Sorry, I have to call it this way for a dictionary in this case. But you can see here now, we have a list essentially. So we can see if we do this type, we'll see it should be a list. Okay. So you basically get your full Python information from here, and we can navigate through it. Obviously, you have to know what those pieces are, either looking through it or going through it piece by piece in order to know what it is, because basically JSON is so, in XML too, basically, it's very flexible. But because it's so flexible, we need to know what it looks like. So there's not like a straightforward go-to, right? So, wow. Fast Victor stinks at spelling. Okay, so creating a data frame with JSON, right? So now we have this information. We have basically a dictionary. Well, in this case, we have a dictionary. The dictionary has a bunch of elements and lists and stuff like this. You can see I saw data.keys, which was meta and data. And I can actually create these data frames from this dictionary. So one thing to note is that this might not always be true for every JSON you read in. In this case, the format of the data is a good format where I can actually put in, I can use this and read it directly into a data frame. If I tried, for example, let's call it df here. If I tried df equals pd, data frame, and then let's say from dict, right? Because that's a dictionary, our whole data. If I did this, this won't work. And it's because it's not formatted properly to be able to read into a Pandas data frame. It's still a dictionary, but it's not well formatted to be used in a data frame. Okay, so know that you just have to know the structure. You can't just simply import it in. And you can see here it's basically saying, oh, there's missing some information and ambiguous order and stuff like this. So this is where, like I said, this is the big part of data science where you're getting information and trying to figure out, okay, I want to learn stuff about this information. But if you're good and you have good structure, hopefully you can just be able to read it into a table-like format, right? So this is kind of how to read it through. And I guess I can show you guys a little bit. For example, df, let's say data. You can see what that looks like. You can see here our columns and stuff like this. Okay, and note that we can, and those null values can turn into nuns, right? So just kind of be aware that's like, okay, our null value can turn into a none value, and hopefully this will kind of be processed well. Now, it's good to know, actually go through it. Like, for example, this right here was a dictionary for a dictionary. And you can see here, Pandas basically exported this as just a string. So be aware of that, like, you know, you can't do a data frame within a data frame, or a data frame can't have a dictionary. So it will read this essentially as a string, which might not be what you want. In this case, you might actually extract this out in a different way and try to figure out what the dictionary is and load that as a different data frame, or create a new column or multiple columns from this one dictionary or whatever it's trying to read in. Okay. Any questions you guys have on this? Okay. Cool. So again, something to play around with. Basically, the reason why I can do this is because I can read data frame. I can create a data frame from a dictionary in Python. Okay, and that's all I'm doing there. So the next part is like, well, okay, cool. We have a data, let's say we have some information, right? And let's say we actually want to put it into a JSON format so we can export it to maybe another program or maybe an API that only accepts JSON objects, right? Or you can say JSON objects, but JSON files. So this right here, basically it's the same code here, but you can see if I write, I should have just go like this. And I go ahead and put this like data. This will actually create a Python-like thing. In this case, it will create a dictionary, and that dictionary will have keys. For example, menu will point to another dictionary, right? And that dictionary has a bunch of keys. In this case, a string, you know, another dictionary, and so on. So you can see here, I have this now. It's not just simply a string, it's now a dictionary in this case. And then I can take this information, oops, I can take this right here, and with open, I'm just gonna write to a JSON file. And just to prove that this does exist, let's go ahead and delete this output because I don't need this because I'm gonna generate that right now. And I'll go ahead and run this, and this will take the data that, in this case, I created up here. I'll put it onto the file. And so you'll see it right here, output.json. You can see here, it's now on a string essentially. In this case, you see it's not well formatted, but it's still valid. It's still valid JSON. So that's how it gets put out. Okay. Any questions on that? Cool. Yeah, pretty simple. Basically, your main idea for JSON is like once you get the JSON, know what the structure is, read it into some form, basically load it into memory of some sort. Like in this case, we're doing a data frame, but other programming languages would have this similar thing kind of stuff where you're reading in JSON, and this is why it's kind of universal. And this tends to be more modern. This tends to be pretty standard. Most places will use a JSON kind of information to pass back and forth. This is really useful, again, like I said, if your data is not structured like like tabular data, where you have a nice table. This right here, like you can see, this isn't really a table structure. This has a little more fluid structure in that sense. Okay, cool. So that leaves us to XML. So XML, like I mentioned, extensible markup language. And if you're familiar with HTML, have you guys seen HTML before? Thumbs up if you have. Maybe seen it a little bit before. Yeah. So if you like if you lived under MySpace and stuff like that, I don't even know if you guys use that, but like if you ever had like MySpace, a lot of people would put in like HTML and stuff like this to mess around. And just know that XML is essentially like generic. I like things like generic HTML. That's what it looks like to me. And so you have these opening tags and these closing tags here, basically saying, okay, this stuff inside is going to be something called like a note. And it's like, okay, within each part now, this is going to be a to object. And you can see, okay, this to is like, no, this is Yona and Benny. And note that it's a little differently structured. These would be strings, right? But we don't use those by standard. We don't use quotation marks. Some do, some don't, but it's not necessary for XML by itself. XML is not programming language compared to JavaScript. Basically, it's just, again, a markup language. It's telling you what things are. So in this case, it's showing you a note, but it could also be just data. So we can actually translate these back and forth. Like there's no reason why you can't take JavaScript data or JSON objects, keep saying objects, JSON files, and converting them into XML, all right? So again, our goal, we can parse it with Python. In this case, Python's a little bit trickier to use, or XML is a little bit trickier to use with Python. We kind of see. So this is the library right here. It's kind of, to be quite honest, not as clear as like importing just JSON, right? But you can see basically we can import this library. We can now go ahead and get that file, that sample.xml. And again, I will show you what that XML file looks like. Oh, fun. Because it's it's trying to read it as a normal XML. But if I read this normally, let's see here if I do this real quick. Workspace, oops, what are we, Flatiron, curriculum, what are we, resources. And then what's our first one? Sorry, I should have had this prepared for you guys. Okay. If I show you what that XML, what's it look like? Sample XML. Oops. You can see here, you can see that structure within here. Okay, and that's our XML. Okay. So I just wanted to show you what that looked like before we read it in. And you can see here, we have properties. I might be able just to go inspect. Let's see if this works fine. No, this works better. So this is a little bit easier to read in that sense. So you can see here is our XML is right here. And we have like starting from this iframe, basically it's a response. The reason why it's not showing this properly is because it's trying to interpret it as a, what's it called? It's trying to interpret it as HTML, basically. It's trying to figure out what this is. But this is what it would normally look like. And you can see here, we have like these nested parts. We have these properties right here. You see like, this is the name of the thing, this row, and we have ID is equal to 1, this UID, this position equals 1. So there's some like other information that's built into each row, okay? And then within that each row, it has information, like in this case, a nested part, election, 2001 candidate. And again, very flexible, but just ordered differently, okay? So that's interesting, I guess. But now we can go ahead and read that into essentially some form that we can actually process it with Python. And so Python, as you notice, it's not valid Python. We have to kind of go around it. So you can basically get for nodes, you can get your children within nodes. Basically, you can think of it more of a tree structure, which is why you can see here we have this element tree. So we start off with this basically top node, like you imagine this node, and then we can go deeper into it. In this case, like, oh, within this node right here, this like part, we can branch into saying, okay, we have the to part, the from, the heading, the body. So one way you can kind of structure this, kind of think it mentally, is if we have this top node right here, this parent we call it, this is like saying, okay, this is a note, and then we might have some properties and stuff like that. But in that note, we have a to structure, we have a from, we have heading, and then we have our last one, body, right? So you can see like all those different parts. And then let's say, for example, we had a to, we had another like nested part in there. It would be something that kind of branches off from here too. Like maybe, for example, to is like first name, and then like last name. Okay, so you kind of have more of this tree structure. So when you're navigating through it, you start off this node here, and you can navigate downward into here, the next parts. Okay, so just know XML tends, it's still used today, it's very common, but it's tend to be seen a little more as the more mature one. And people nowadays mostly want to use JSON just because you can see how nice it is to actually use JSON and directly put that essentially into Python format. And you can kind of read it very quickly. Versus XML, you have to do some fancy footwork. So you can see here, for example, I have to basically create my first children and grandchildren, do these. In this case, I did nested, not nested, but list comprehension. And this one's a nested loop basically within this list comprehension. So first children, just kind of showing you a little bit. We can have these things like the tag, which is basically this guy is my tag, basically what kind of thing is it? And then we saw earlier with the example, we can have properties within there, and that's where this like dot attribute is. So this first tag, for example, is row. There's no attribute. We can check out the grandchildren. There's 285 grandchildren. You can see the name of the tag is row. And then, like I said, the attributes, that ID was 1, UID. So now it's a dictionary. We can actually reference it a little bit easier in Python. But again, it's not, in my opinion, it's not as easy to kind of navigate as what JSON would be. Okay. And we can see we can go through the whole thing by basically doing some iterating through the loop. Note this root.iter basically allows us to pull out each root as they come through. It's something called a generator. It's just another way for us to basically process through the XML. And you can see here, I go for each element in there, looping into her deeper and deeper and deeper. In this case, I'm looking at each part row, and then within that next part is my element tag name right here, the IDs, and then if there's an attribute in here. So again, you can see candid, candidate, or can name, office borough, can class, C8, I don't know what that is, can class. Okay, so you can see that you can kind of navigate through this stuff. If I wanted to go a little bit deeper, you can see, for example, if I go like 40, you can see all this going through. So again, another way to have data and process through. And to be quite honest, is that when you first start with XML, again, XML data, I would strongly suggest like going through the documentation and seeing how to process it through. It's a little, in my opinion, it's a little bit harder to like think it through, but it's not too bad once you get used to it. It's just kind of a different way of thinking about it. And of course, if you're trying to send information that only accepts XML, you can use code, same thing from that library, to basically take in, where are we? Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. we can also take data and put it into an XML format. In that case, I don't actually know if there's a direct to XML. I think there might be in Pandas. I could be wrong. I don't usually. Yeah. So you can look it up if you need to. So that's the amazing part of Google, right? So use your resource. But the whole point, I can actually put this into data frame, but note that it's not as simple as just reading it into a data frame. I have to kind of navigate through the tree, adding parts into the data frame as needed. So that's what you can see this .append part. So just know it's a little bit more work into thinking, going from a tree format, which is really what XML is built into, versus a JSON file, where a JSON really is much closer to how Python thinks of dictionaries and lists, which are really useful when we talk about series and data frames and pandas. Okay. So any questions you guys have about any of this stuff? Okay, cool. Yeah. XML tends to be, like I said, tends to be on the older side. A lot of finances and stuff like that will pass XML through. But most modern stuff will likely use JSON, not that XML is like deprecated or anything like that. So comparing the two formats, this one's actually a great website right here. Kind of shows you some similar stuff like JSON versus XML, and you can see they do two different things. This right here essentially is the same file, same information, like glossary, title, but instead of it's written JSON and then also written in JavaScript, or not Java, XML. So know that you can kind of translate it back and forth, and they're the same thing, they're just structured a little bit differently. Okay. So cool. Any last questions about JSON, XML, when you would use it, where you'd see it? Okay, cool. Sound good? All right. So when we get an XML file or JSON file, you can kind of see that there's a lot of varied structure, but there's a lot of nested like parts into it, right? You can see that there can be a lot of information going deeper and deeper and deeper in. And so when we do that kind of stuff, we use something called recursion.